The air in Nelsonville still tasted the same, a mix of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, sweet scent of sawmills long since closed. I'd spent the better part of a decade trying to forget it, trading the dense Appalachian hills for the dust and rock of places I had no business being. But the Army was done with me, and this quiet corner of Ohio was the only place left that felt like a tether. I'd bought a small plot of land bordering the Wayne National Forest, a place where the trees whispered stories older than the town itself. The plan was simple: fix the cabin, keep to myself, and let the quiet soak into my bones until the ringing in my ears finally faded. That plan lasted exactly 3 weeks. The quiet here wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. It started with small talk at the general store, the kind of hushed gossip that travels faster than a brush fire. The Crawfords, a family with a farmstead pressed right up against the forest's edge, had vanished. Not packed up and left, vanished. Their truck was in the driveway, half-eaten dinner on the table, cattle lowing in the fields, unfed and agitated. The sheriff's department had been combing the area for days, turning up nothing but churned mud and a growing sense of dread. Sheriff Brody met me on my porch 2 days later. He was a man worn down by his office, his face a roadmap of local troubles. We'd known each other since high school, before I'd gone off to play soldier. "Mark," he said, skipping the pleasantries and accepting the coffee I offered. "Heard you were back. Figured I should stop by, seeing as you're the Crawfords' closest neighbor now." "Anything on them?" I asked, leaning against the railing. He shook his head, staring out at the wall of green that was the Wayne. "Nothing clean. We found tracks. That's the problem. They're all over the edge of their property." He took a long sip of coffee. "They're bipedal. Big. Stride is close to 9 feet between steps. Whatever made 'em has got a gait wider than any man I've ever seen. It's like something heavy was trying to walk like a person and not quite getting it right. The ground's torn up, but there are no vehicle marks, no sign of a struggle at the house. They just walked off into the trees with it." My ranger training kicked in before I could stop it. A 9-foot stride meant immense height or an unnatural gait. Bipedal meant not a bear. The lack of a struggle meant compliance or an unbelievably swift abduction, any other sign. "Just one thing," Brody said, his voice dropping. "The forensics team found some hairs snagged on the barbed wire fence. They're not bear, not coyote, not deer. They don't match anything in the database. Lab tech called it canine, but anomalous." He finished his coffee and set the mug down. "Just be careful out here, Mark. Lock your doors. The woods aren't what they used to be." Later that week, I drove my truck down a dirt track to see an old friend, a state forester named Al. He lived in a small cabin deeper in the preserve, a man who knew the forest's moods better than his own. We shared a flask of bourbon as the sun bled out behind the ridges. "You hearing 'em at night?" Al asked, his eyes fixed on the tree line. "Hearing what?" "The calls," he said. "Started a month back. It ain't coyotes, and it sure as hell ain't black bears. It's a howl, yeah? But it ends in something else like a signal. A deep, guttural roar that makes the damn windows rattle. They're coordinating. One calls from the North Ridge, another answers from the hollow, like they're mapping things out." My blood ran cold. Coordinated signals, tactical positioning. That wasn't animal behavior. That was hunting behavior. The unease followed me into town. The local watering hole, the poorhouse, was buzzing with the usual Friday night crowd, but a new tension hung in the air. In a corner booth, I saw them, a group of 4 men and 1 woman, clustered around a table covered in topographical maps and what looked like sensor schematics. They weren't locals. Their gear was too clean, their postures too rigid. They wore practical field clothing, and the bulges under their jackets weren't beer bellies. They carried themselves with the quiet intensity of people who were here for a purpose. The man who seemed to be their leader caught my eye. He was in his late 40s, with a square jaw and the kind of tired, knowing eyes I'd seen on countless officers. He nodded for me to come over. "You're Mark Keller," he said as I approached. It wasn't a question. "I'm Jack Morrigan." His handshake was firm, a Marine's grip. He introduced the others, their names and roles rattling off with military efficiency. Then he got straight to the point. "We heard a former Ranger Scout just moved back to the area. Someone who knows these woods and knows how to track more than just deer," Jack said, his gaze unwavering. "We're here for what took the Crawfords. We're a private team. We hunt things that law enforcement isn't equipped to handle." I was about to brush him off as some kind of cryptid-chasing fanatic, but the woman, their tech specialist, slid a tablet across the table. "This was recovered from a trail camera on a property 2 miles south of the Crawfords," she said. "The timestamp is from the night they disappeared." I picked it up. The video was grainy, shot in the ghostly green of infrared. It showed a deer feeder, a few does cautiously eating. Then, their heads snapped up, and they bolted. The camera shook slightly. From the right side of the frame, something emerged from the shadows. It walked on 2 long, digitigrade legs, like the hind legs of a dog. Its arms were too long, ending in what looked like massive clawed hands. It was thin, almost skeletal, but moved with a terrifying fluid power. It paused, turning its head. The neck was unnaturally long, and atop it sat a narrow canine head with a snout full of teeth. It scanned the clearing for a moment before melting back into the darkness. It wasn't a man in a suit. It wasn't a bear with mange. The way it moved was predatory, ancient. It moved like it owned the forest. "The locals call them dogmen," Jack said, his voice a low gravel. "We have a different name for them. Apex predators. We're going in after them, and we need a tracker who understands asymmetric warfare because that's what this is. We're being hunted by something that thinks. We could use your help, Keller." I looked from the chilling image on the screen to the deep, impenetrable darkness outside the bar's window. The quiet life I'd planned was a fantasy. The war hadn't ended when I left the desert. It had just followed me home. The next morning I found myself in an old, musty hunting cabin tucked away near the eastern edge of the Wayne National Forest. It was Jack's forward operating base. The air inside was thick with the scent of gun oil, coffee, and damp wood. Maps were pinned to the walls, covered in circles, arrows, and handwritten notes. This wasn't a weekend hunting trip. It was a military operation. Jack stood before the main map, briefing me and the rest of his team. "All right, let's formalize this, Mark. This is the crew," he began, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man used to command. He gestured to the woman from the bar. "Hannah Doyle. She's our eyes and ears. Former Air Force, worked with surveillance drones. If it moves out there, her sensors will pick it up." Hannah gave a curt nod, her fingers already dancing across a ruggedized laptop, bringing up satellite imagery of the surrounding terrain. He pointed to a large, broad-shouldered man cleaning a heavy-caliber rifle with meticulous care. "Tyler Briggs, our designated marksman, grew up hunting elk in the mountains of Utah. He can hit a moving target from 800 yards in a crosswind." Tyler glanced up, his expression one of pure, unadulterated confidence. "Just point me at it, Jack." A quieter man was organizing medical kits on a makeshift table. He had a focused, steady presence. Derek Holt, our corpsman, served 2 tours in Afghanistan. If you get hurt, he's the one who'll put you back together. Derek simply nodded, his attention fixed on a pack of QuickClot. Finally, Jack indicated a wiry man who was studying a set of plaster casts of the tracks Sheriff Brody had described. And this is Ben Carver. Best tracker I've ever seen. He's an expert in animal behavior, but his real specialty is predators. He understands how they think, how they hunt. Ben looked up, his eyes sharp and analytical. These things aren't just animals, Jack. The gait, the stride length, it's calculated. They're covering ground efficiently, but they're also trying to mimic a human walk. It's a deception. Exactly, Jack said, turning back to the map, which brings us to what we're dealing with. Forget what you've seen in movies. These aren't werewolves. There's no transformation, no silver bullet nonsense. We believe they're a relic species, a deeply isolated branch of predator that has survived in these mountains for centuries, maybe millennia. They're intelligent, they're territorial, and they're carnivores. He tapped a red circle on the map that encompassed the Crawford farm and a wide swath of forest. Look at the recent incidents. The Crawford family disappears without a trace. A month before that, a hiker goes missing on the North Country Trail 3 weeks ago. A dozen cattle found ripped apart on a farm to the west. Not eaten, torn apart. It's territorial marking, a message. Ben stepped forward, holding up one of the casts. Look at the claw marks from the cattle. They're not from a bear. A bear mauls, it swipes. These are precise, deep punctures, targeted at the spine and major arteries. It's the work of a predator that knows anatomy. It's killing for sport, or as a warning. And on every scene, there's one thing missing, an exit trail. They come in, they do their work, and they vanish. They know how to cover their tracks, or they use routes we can't see. Hannah spoke up, not looking away from her screen. Their vocalizations are complex. I've been running audio from the last 48 hours through a pattern analysis program. It's not just random howling. There are distinct sequences, a low-frequency roar followed by a series of high-pitched clicks. I think the roar is a long-range signal to establish location, and the clicks are short-range commands. They're talking to each other. The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture that made the hair on my arms stand up. This wasn't just a hunt for a monster. We were preparing to engage an enemy that used combined arms tactics, surveillance, psychological warfare, coordinated movements. They use fear as a weapon, Jack continued, his voice grim. They'll watch a target for days, learn its routines. They make noise on the edge of a property, testing reactions. They'll let you catch a glimpse of them in the shadows, just enough to make you doubt your sanity. I looked around at the team. They were professionals, each an expert in their field. But they were facing an enemy that had the ultimate home field advantage. An enemy that had been perfecting its craft in these woods since before the first settlers arrived. "I'm in," I said, the words coming out before I'd fully processed the decision. But on one condition: we operate under strict discipline. No one goes anywhere alone. We maintain noise and light discipline at night. We move with tactical spacing. We treat this like a combat patrol, not a hunting party. Jack's lips curled into a half-smile. That's why I wanted you, Keller. I wouldn't have it any other way. He clapped his hands together. All right, gear up. We're moving out in 30 minutes. Our initial operating base is this cabin. We'll do short-range reconnaissance patrols from here, establish a perimeter with Hannah's sensors, and try to draw them in. We need to confirm their numbers and find their lair. The mood in the cabin shifted. The quiet focus intensified as everyone began their final preparations. Tyler chambered around, the sound echoing with finality. Derek packed extra tourniquets. Ben studied his maps one last time. Hannah calibrated a small wasp-like drone. I checked my own rifle. The familiar weight a small comfort as I loaded the magazines. I couldn't shake the image from the trail camera, the long canine head turning, its unseen eyes scanning the darkness. It knew we were here. And it was waiting. We were walking into its territory, and it was already hunting us. We pushed into the forest at dusk, the world dissolving into a mosaic of gray and green. The air grew heavy and cool, thick with the smell of damp soil and rotting wood. We moved in a staggered file, maintaining a 5-yard separation. A habit beaten into me by years of experience, Jack took the lead, with Ben just behind him, his eyes scanning the forest floor. I was in the rear, my head on a constant swivel, watching our back trail. The silence was the first thing that felt wrong. The usual evening chorus of insects and birds was gone. The woods were holding their breath. An hour in, Ben held up a closed fist, the universal signal to halt. He pointed upward. About 10 feet off the ground, a thick branch on a sycamore tree had been snapped clean in two. The break was fresh, the wood underneath pale and splintered. "Too high for a deer to rub its antlers," Ben whispered, his voice barely disturbing the air. "Too clean a break for wind damage." Something tall and powerful did that. A show of strength. I scanned the surrounding trees. It wasn't just one now that we were looking for them. We saw more. Branches were twisted and broken at unnatural heights, always on the edge of the game trail we were following. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. They were marking a path, or a boundary. We continued, the tension ratcheting up with every step. A little further on, we found the first totem, as Ben called it. It was a macabre sculpture of branches and animal bones woven together and wedged between two young oak trees. A deer skull, stripped clean, sat at its center, its empty eye sockets staring down the path toward us. The construction was too complex for an animal. It was a signpost, a warning. "You are entering our land." We made camp in a small, defensible clearing with a rock outcropping to our backs. There would be no fire. Cold rations and silent vigilance were the orders of the night. Hannah set up her perimeter sensors, small, camouflaged units that would detect motion and heat. She sat with her laptop, a ghostly green light illuminating her focused expression. The first call came just after midnight. It started as a low, mournful howl that climbed in pitch until it sounded like something between a wolf and a screaming woman. It echoed through the hollows from the north. Before it faded, another answered from the west, this one deeper, more guttural. Then a third from the east. They were triangulating our position. "They're bracketing us," I muttered to Jack, my hand tightening on my rifle. "They're letting us know they're here," he replied, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond our camp, testing our discipline. Suddenly, the howls stopped. They were replaced by a new sound, one that was far more disturbing. It was a series of rhythmic clicks and pops, like a recording of a bullwhip being played backward. The sounds came from different directions, overlapping and creating a disorienting, almost conversational rhythm. It felt like they were right on top of us, hidden just beyond the range of our night vision. "What the hell is that?" Tyler breathed, his rifle pressed tight to his shoulder. "Short-range communication," Hannah whispered, her eyes glued to her screen. "They've stopped broadcasting their positions." They're coordinating an approach. She launched her smallest drone, a dark, insect-like machine that rose almost silently into the canopy. The feed appeared on her screen. We all crowded around, watching the thermal imaging. "Got 'em," she said, pointing to the display. 2 bright orange heat signatures were moving through the trees about 200 yards from our position. They weren't moving in a straight line. They moved in short bursts, from one point of cover to the next, a perfect tactical advance. As one moved, the other remained still, providing overwatch. Then they'd switch. My stomach clenched. I'd used that exact bounding overwatch technique 100 times in the field. This wasn't an animal hunting by instinct. This was a trained unit executing a maneuver. "They're just watching," Ben observed, his voice tight. "They're not committing. They're studying us." As if on cue, the heat signatures melted back into the cooler background of the forest and disappeared. The clicking stopped. The woods fell silent once more, but the silence was now filled with a palpable menace. An hour before dawn, as a cold mist began to snake through the trees, I did a slow sweep of the camp's perimeter. Near the western edge, I found a faint trail, almost invisible, leading away from our position. It was deliberately concealed. Leaves and dirt had been brushed over the tracks, but not perfectly. A patch of moss was scuffed, a small stone overturned. This was tradecraft. Someone or something had gotten within 50 feet of our camp, observed us, and slipped away without triggering Hannah's sensors. It must have moved with painstaking slowness, mimicking the background temperature. A feat of stealth that would have impressed a special forces operator. I was showing Jack and Ben the camouflaged trail when a sudden, violent thump came from our camp. We spun around, rifles up. A fist-sized rock had punched a hole through the corrugated tin roof of a small, dilapidated shed at the edge of the clearing. Derek and Tyler were already there, weapons trained on the trees. The throw hadn't been an arc. The angle was too flat. It had been thrown like a fastball with incredible force and precision. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't meant to hit any of us. It was a message. "We can get to you whenever we want." Jack stared at the hole in the roof, then at the oppressive wall of trees surrounding us. His jaw was set. "They're done watching. They're trying to spook us, make us run." He looked at me, his eyes dark with resolve. "We're not running, we're going deeper. Pack it up. We're taking the fight to them." The sun was beginning to rise, but the forest seemed to be getting darker. We were no longer the hunters. We were the bait. We broke camp under a steel-gray sky. The morning light struggling to pierce the thick canopy. Jack's decision was firm. We were pushing north, toward the higher ridges where the oak and maple groves were so dense they formed natural, light-starved tunnels. This was the terrain where a conventional search party would get lost in minutes, the kind of place where things could hide for centuries. The team was quiet, the bravado from the cabin replaced by a grim professional focus. The rock thrown through the shed roof had been a declaration of war. The land grew more difficult with every mile. We navigated steep, muddy ravines and crossed boggy lowlands where the air hung still and smelled of decay. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick roots and hidden hollows. It was a landscape designed to break ankles and spirits. Ben and I took point. Our senses stretched to the breaking point. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. The woods were no longer neutral territory. They felt actively hostile. We found an old, overgrown fire trail, a barely visible scar on the landscape. It was there we found the first definitive sign of the Crawford's drag marks. 2 parallel grooves in the damp earth, about 3 feet apart, heading deeper into the woods. They were partially obscured, but the story they told was clear. Something heavy had been dragged through here. "No signs of a struggle," Ben noted, crouching low. "The earth isn't churned up. Whoever was being dragged was either unconscious or already gone." He pointed to a small, dark stain on a cluster of leaves. "And that's blood." Derek came forward and took a sample, his face grim. "We'll assume it's human until proven otherwise." The trail led us on for another half-mile before Ben stopped dead, holding up a hand. He was looking up into the branches of a massive white pine. I followed his gaze. Wedged tightly in a fork about 30 feet up was a small, camouflaged box, a trail camera. "That's the Crawfords," Tyler said, recognizing the brand. "Why the hell is it up there?" The answer was chillingly obvious. Something had taken it from its original position and deliberately hidden it, placing it far above a human's line of sight. Something that understood what it was and didn't want its picture taken. Tyler, being the most agile climber, volunteered to retrieve it. He shimmied up the trunk, untangled the device, and brought it down. Hannah took it, her expression grim. "The casing is cracked, and there's moisture in the lens, but the memory card looks intact." She plugged it into her tablet. We huddled around as she worked. Most of the files were corrupted, but she managed to salvage the last 30 seconds of footage. The video flickered to life. It was nighttime, the infrared image showing the Crawfords' back porch. The screen was static-filled. A shape moved at the edge of the frame. It was tall and gaunt. Then the camera was abruptly ripped from its mount. The world became a dizzying, violent blur of green and black. For a horrifying second, a face filled the screen, a long canine snout, lips curled back to reveal yellowed fangs. But the eyes were the worst part. They weren't animal eyes. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a cold, hateful malevolence. Then the screen went black. A heavy silence fell over the group. Seeing it on a screen in a bar was one thing. Seeing the last moments of a family's life, recorded through the lens of their own stolen camera, was something else entirely. We pressed on, the forest growing darker and more claustrophobic. The trees were scarred with fresh claw marks, deep gouges in the bark. They weren't random scratches. I recognized the pattern. It was a 3-claw grouping, repeated at regular intervals. It was a trail marker, a wayfinding system for something moving at night. But more than that, the marks were angled away from the trail. It was a schematic for a flanking maneuver, a battle exit. They were showing us how they would surround us. Suddenly, a sharp thwack echoed from the ridge to our left. It was the distinct sound of wood striking wood. It was followed by 2 more quick strikes. A pause, then a single, harder thwack from the right. "A code," I said, my voice low. 131, they're reporting our position." Jack nodded, his face a mask of stone. "They're not just tracking us. They're coordinating an ambush. Find us a defensible position. Now." We scrambled off the trail, moving toward a cluster of large boulders that offered some cover. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and reach for us. As night fell, the sound started again. Not howls this time, but the subtle, terrifying sounds of movement just beyond our sight. A branch cracking under a heavy foot. The soft scuff of a claw on stone. They were all around us. Hannah deployed her drone again, its quiet hum barely audible. The thermal feed showed at least 5 heat signatures moving in a wide, perfect arc around our position. They maintained their distance, staying just outside effective rifle range. They were a pack of wolves, but they were moving with the discipline of a fire team. They weren't rushing in. They were probing our defenses, testing our reactions, watching how we positioned ourselves. They were learning. "They're boxing us in," Tyler whispered, aiming his rifle into the oppressive darkness. "They're setting the kill zone." The woods, which had once been my refuge, had become a cage, and we were trapped inside with the keepers. They weren't just beasts, they were soldiers, and their war had been going on for a very long time. The night was a long, cold purgatory. We stood watch in shifts, backs against the unyielding stone of the boulders, straining to see past the reach of our night vision goggles. The creatures never fully committed to an attack. They remained a ghostly presence on the thermal scope, a ring of patient predators tightening a noose. They would test a section of our perimeter, a flicker of movement in the underbrush, only to melt away when a weapon was trained in their direction. It was a war of nerves, and they were masters of it. Dawn arrived not with relief, but with a thicker, more suffocating dread. The gray light filtered through the canopy, revealing a forest floor shrouded in a damp, clinging mist. The world seemed muted and dead. We did a head count, our voices hushed and raw from the cold. "Jack, Hannah, Tyler, Derek." I called out. Then I paused. "Ben?" Silence. I turned to where he'd been posted near the edge of our makeshift camp. His sleeping bag was there, laid out neatly. His pack was beside it. But Ben Carver was gone. "No," Jack breathed, his face paling. No. We converged on the spot. There were no signs of a struggle. Not a single scuffed leaf, not a broken twig. The ground around his position was undisturbed. His rifle was leaning against his pack. Untouched, it was impossible. Ben was the lightest sleeper, the most attuned to the forest. For him to be taken without making a sound, without anyone hearing a thing, was a feat of stealth that bordered on the supernatural. My ranger instincts took over, pushing the fear down. I began a methodical sweep of the area, a concentric circle search pattern. "They didn't drag him," I said, my voice low and tight. "There's no trail. They lifted him." On the bark of a nearby maple, about 8 feet up, I found them. Fresh scratches, not the deep gouges of their trail markers, but shallower, frantic marks. They pointed straight up, as if something had scaled the tree to get a vantage point. From there, it could have dropped down silently. Right behind him, a professional ambush. "Hannah, get the drone up," Jack commanded, his voice strained. "Thermal. Maximum altitude. I want a 360-degree view." The drone shot upward, a dark speck against the brightening sky. The feed on Hannah's tablet was a rolling tapestry of orange and blue. For a minute, there was nothing. Then, she gasped. "There. Northwest quadrant. Moving fast." She angled the camera. On the screen, a single large heat signature was moving through the dense woods, away from us. It was massive, clearly bipedal. And it was carrying a smaller, cooler shape slung over its shoulder. The shape was human-sized. It was Ben. "I have a direction," I said, shouldering my pack. "We have to go. Now." We moved out, abandoning all pretense of stealth. We were no longer hunting. We were in pursuit. The trail was non-existent to the naked eye, but the drone gave us a vector. We crashed through the undergrowth, the silence of the forest now more terrifying than the sounds of the night before. There were no birds, no squirrels, no insects. The entire ecosystem had fallen silent, as if in deference to the masters of this domain. The forest itself was watching us, complicit in its silence. After 20 minutes of hard pursuit, Hannah brought the drone back. "Losing signal. The canopy is too thick." We were on our own. We slowed our pace, forced to rely on tracking skills. But there was nothing to track. We found a single haunting piece of evidence. A small scrap of ripstop fabric, the same material as Ben's jacket, snagged on a thorny bush. Beyond that, the trail went completely cold. The ground transitioned into a wide, stony ridge, a tracker's nightmare. There were no prints, no scuff marks, no broken vegetation. They had vanished, taking Ben with them. We stood on that desolate ridge, the silence pressing in. The loss was a physical blow. Ben had been our expert, the one who was supposed to understand these things. His silent, effortless abduction sent a clear message. Your skills mean nothing. We are better at this than you will ever be. "What's the play, Jack?" Tyler asked. His voice tight with a mixture of fear and anger. Jack stared into the impenetrable woods where Ben had been taken. His face was a mask of cold fury. I could see the conflict in his eyes. The commander's instinct to protect his people versus the mission's brutal objective. "They're trying to pick us apart," he said, his voice a low growl. "Make us bleed. Make us run. But we're not running. They've made this personal now. Ben is either a hostage or a meal. Either way, we're going to find out. We press on. We find their lair, and we burn it to the ground." His words were meant to inspire, but they landed like stones in my stomach. He was letting emotion cloud his judgment. We hadn't just lost a man. We had lost our expert on the enemy. We were moving blind into a territory controlled by a foe that had just demonstrated its complete superiority. They weren't just luring us into a trap. They were leading us to our graves, one by one. Following the direction Ben had been taken, we descended from the stony ridge into a part of the forest that felt fundamentally different. The trees here were older, larger, their branches forming a dense, interlocking canopy that plunged the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. The air was colder, stagnant, carrying a faint musky odor that reminded me of a wolf den, but sharper, with an undercurrent of something acrid like rot. The signs of their presence were no longer subtle warnings. They were evidence of a permanent settlement. The ground was crisscrossed with well-worn paths, too wide and packed down to have been made by deer. We saw numerous shallow pits dug into the earth, some filled with the bleached bones of animals, and what looked unsettlingly like human femurs. This wasn't just a hunting ground. It was a territory, a domain. My military mind, trained to assess terrain and enemy fortifications, reeled at what I was seeing. This wasn't the behavior of a pack of beasts. It was the rudimentary infrastructure of a society, a predatory society. We came to a clearing dominated by a bizarre and terrifying structure. Two massive fallen logs, each thicker than my truck, had been propped against each other to form a crude 20-foot-tall archway. Smaller logs and branches were wedged into place to stabilize it. It was a feat of primitive engineering that would have required immense coordinated strength. It wasn't a shelter. It was a monument. A gateway. As we cautiously approached the arch, a new sound reached us, carried on the dead air. It was a series of low, guttural clicks and pops, the same short-range communication we'd heard during the night. But this time, it was conversational. There were different tones, different rhythms, a back and forth that sounded like multiple individuals communicating. They were close. Jack motioned for us to take cover in a thicket of rhododendron from our hiding place. We could see the area beyond the arch. It was a large, natural depression in the landscape, almost like an amphitheater, and it was active. Two of the creatures were there. They were moving with a purpose, dragging a deer carcass toward a dark opening in the hillside that looked like the entrance to a cave or burrow. Seeing them in the dim daylight was far worse than the grainy infrared footage. Their gray-black hide was stretched tight over corded muscle. They moved with an unsettling grace, a blend of canine and primate. Their intelligence was palpable in every deliberate movement. Marking their location, we backed away slowly, the sounds of their clicking language fading behind us. We had found their nest. We circled the area, looking for a better vantage point, a place to observe and plan. On the northern edge of their territory, hidden beneath a curtain of overgrown vines, we found it a slab of reinforced concrete nearly invisible against the hillside. A heavy steel door, rusted but solid, was set into it. It was a Cold War-era fallout shelter, forgotten by time. "This is it," Jack whispered, a grim smile on his face. "A fortified position. We can observe from here, and if things go bad, we can make a stand." Using a pry bar from Tyler's pack, we managed to force the rusted door open with a groan of tortured metal. The air that rushed out was stale and cold. We entered cautiously, flashlights cutting through decades of darkness. The inside was a single large concrete room, littered with the debris of a long-abandoned government outpost, but it wasn't empty. The concrete walls were covered in scratches. Deep, powerful gouges that could only have been made by the creature's claws. They knew about this place. They had been in here. But that wasn't the most horrifying discovery. On the far wall, illuminated by the sweeping beams of our flashlights, were drawings. They weren't the crude finger paintings of a caveman. They were detailed, etched into the concrete with a sharp rock or claw. They depicted tall, bipedal canine figures hunting. Their prey was varied: deer, bear, and humans. Stick figures carrying primitive spears and bows were shown being overwhelmed, dragged away, surrounded. One mural was particularly chilling. It showed the dogman figures standing over a pile of human bodies next to what was clearly the Hocking River in the background. Other figures were building something. A structure of logs that looked disturbingly similar to the archway we had just seen. The human figures in this drawing weren't pioneers with rifles. They were Native Americans. A cold wave of understanding washed over me. We had been incredibly arrogant. We'd come here to hunt a monster, a cryptid, a biological anomaly. We were wrong. We hadn't stumbled upon the lair of a pack of beasts. We had trespassed into the heart of a civilization that had been here long before us, that had hunted our ancestors, that viewed us as nothing more than invasive, clever prey. They hadn't just survived in these woods. They had ruled them. And we, with our guns and our technology, had just walked into their capital city, announcing our presence like fools. The rock through the shed, Ben's abduction. It wasn't just a warning. It was a tactical response from a thinking enemy defending its homeland. We weren't the hunters. We had been the quarry from the moment we set foot in their forest. The heavy steel door of the bunker clanged shut, the sound echoing in the concrete box like a death knell. We were sealed inside, but it didn't feel like safety. It felt like we had just locked ourselves in a tomb. Jack immediately started issuing orders, his voice sharp, pulling us back from the horror of the drawings on the wall. "Derek, Tyler, barricade that door. Use anything you can find. I don't want it rattling. Hannah, set up your sensors facing the entrance and at the ventilation shafts. I want to know the second they get close. Mark, with me. We need to find firing positions." The bunker was a simple design. A single large room with a smaller one off to the side, likely for a generator. 2 narrow ventilation shafts, covered by rusted grills, were set high on the walls near the ceiling. offering the only other point of entry besides the main door. They were too small for a man to fit through, but for the gaunt, unnaturally flexible creatures we'd seen. It was a possibility we couldn't ignore. Tyler and Derek braced the door with old metal lockers and a heavy table, creating a solid barricade. Hannah placed motion detectors and thermal sensors outside, running the thin wires under the door before we sealed it. I found 2 firing ports, narrow slits in the concrete, probably for observation, that had been covered with steel plates. With some effort, we managed to work one of the plates loose, creating a narrow field of fire covering the approach to the bunker. It wasn't much, but it was better than being blind. As darkness fell outside, the world inside our concrete box became a bubble of tense silence, broken only by the hum of Hannah's equipment and our own ragged breathing. We sat with our backs to the walls, rifles across our laps, waiting. The drawings of ancient hunts seemed to mock us from the walls. The attack began without a sound. "Contact," Hannah whispered, her eyes wide. Multiple heat signatures. They're emerging from the burrow entrance, moving this way, fast. On her screen, we watched a dozen orange figures detach from the hillside and flow toward our position like a river of heat. They didn't howl or roar. They moved with a chilling, silent purpose. They knew exactly where we were. The first test was a feint. 3 of them rushed the main door, their massive forms appearing in our narrow firing port for a split second before they vanished into the blind spot below. We held our fire. It was a classic move to draw out our positions and make us waste ammunition. "They're splitting up," Hannah reported, her voice strained. 3 at the door. 4 are circling to the west wall. The others, I don't know. They vanished from thermal. They're using the terrain to mask their heat. "They move like a trained squad," I murmured, my eye pressed to the firing port. Suppression element at the front, flanking teams on the move. This was beyond animal cunning. This was learned, practiced military doctrine. A loud, metallic screech from above made us all jump. One of them was on the roof trying to tear at the ventilation grill. Derek aimed his rifle upward. "Don't fire unless it breaks through," Jack ordered. "The muzzle flash will blind us." Then the main assault began. A heavy rhythmic thud, thud, thud slammed against the steel door, making the entire structure vibrate. They were using a battering ram, or one of their own was simply hammering its body against the barricade. At the same time, a horrible scraping sound started at the firing port. A claw, long and black, scrabbled at the concrete, trying to find purchase, trying to widen the opening. Suddenly, Tyler yelled in pain. He'd been positioned near the door, and one of the creature's claws had punched through the thick steel like it was tin foil, catching him in the shoulder. The claw, as long as a hunting knife, ripped a deep gash before retracting. "I'm hit!" Derek was on him in an instant, pulling him away from the door and ripping open a medical pack. The metallic tang of blood filled the air.
"Hannah, where are they?" Jack yelled over the din. "Everywhere," she cried. "They're all around us, and there's one that's bigger than the rest. It's not attacking, it's just watching. From the trees, it's directing them."
A leader. An officer. The assault intensified. The scraping at the vent cover became a frantic tearing of metal. The pounding on the door grew more frenzied. Then, one of them made a mistake. It moved into the narrow field of view of our firing port, its attention on the door. It was a perfect profile shot. "Taking it," Tyler gritted out, his left arm useless, but his rifle steady on his good shoulder. He fired. The roar of the rifle in the confined space was deafening. The creature outside let out a choked, high-pitched shriek and collapsed, A momentary silence fell outside. Then a new sound began. A low, furious roar that came from the tree line. It was the leader. It was enraged. In that moment, Hannah swiveled a powerful, battery-operated floodlight toward the firing port and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the creature Tyler had shot. It was sprawled on the ground, its canine head twisted at an unnatural angle. But as the light caught another one that was rushing forward to drag the body away, I saw its face clearly, its eyes. They weren't glowing or reflective like a wolf's. They were set forward in its skull and they absorbed the light. They were human-like eyes, filled with a terrifying, reasoning hatred. Its body was a nightmarish fusion of man and beast. But its eyes were the windows to a soul as old and as cold as the stones around us. The creatures outside unleashed a deafening chorus of rage-filled howls. The siege had failed, but they weren't broken. As their shrieks echoed through the forest, they began to retreat, the heat signatures on Hannah's screen pulling back in an organized withdrawal. They were gone. For now. We were alive, but we were trapped. Tyler was wounded, our ammunition was depleted, and they knew our exact position. They had tested our defenses, found a weakness, and taken a casualty. They would not make the same mistake twice. The next wave wouldn't be a test, it would be an execution. The silence that followed their retreat was heavy and suffocating. Derek had managed to stop the bleeding in Tyler's shoulder, but the wound was deep, and a feverish glaze was already creeping into the marksman's eyes. We were running low on water, and the air in the bunker was growing thin and foul. "They'll be back before dawn," Jack stated, his voice flat. "They'll come with a new plan. They'll collapse the vents or find a way to rip the door off its hinges. We can't win a war of attrition here." He was right. Staying put was a death sentence. Our only chance was to move. "There's a tributary of the Hocking River about 3 miles east of here," I said, pointing to a line on my map. "It runs through a deep ravine. The terrain is rough, but it offers a direct path out of their central territory. If we can get to the water, it'll mask our scent and our trail. It's our only shot at an extraction." It was a desperate plan, a high-stakes gamble. We'd be leaving our only hard cover to make a run through an open forest controlled by an enemy that was faster, stronger, and knew the terrain intimately. "It's a long shot, but it's the only one we've got," Jack agreed. "We move in 5 minutes. We leave anything that isn't essential: ammo, water, medical supplies only." We dismantled the barricade, the scraping of metal loud enough to wake the dead. Every sound felt like a betrayal. As we cracked the heavy steel door, the cool night air felt like a slap in the face. The forest was utterly black and silent. The body of the creature we had shot was gone. They had policed their dead. We moved out in a tight diamond formation, with me on point, and Jack covering our rear. Tyler, leaning heavily on Derek, was in the center. We moved as quietly as we could along an old, overgrown logging road, a faint scar visible only with night vision. The forest floor was a minefield of dry leaves and brittle twigs. Every step was a thunderclap in the unnatural silence. We'd gone maybe half a mile when the feeling of being watched returned, a cold prickle on the back of my neck. They were back. The first sound was a faint rustle off to our right, then the snapping of a twig to our left. They were shadowing us, moving parallel to our path, staying just inside the thickest parts of the undergrowth. They weren't attacking. They were hurting us. I saw a flicker of movement through my scope, a tall, dark shape slipping between 2 ancient oaks. They were keeping pace with us effortlessly, their long strides eating up the distance. The psychological pressure was immense. They wanted us to panic, to run blindly and exhaust ourselves. As we neared a swampy lowland, a place where the ground was soft and movement was slow, one of them made a bold move. It broke cover, a fleeting silhouette against the slightly less black sky, and sprinted across a clearing about 100 yards ahead of us. It was a deliberate maneuver to cut off our route, to force us south, away from the river and deeper into a box canyon. They were channeling us into a pre-selected kill zone.
"They're flanking us. They're trying to turn us," Hannah yelled. "We're not changing course," I said, my voice low and urgent. "They expect us to react. We push through."
I had one last trick up my sleeve. From my pack, I pulled a small block of C4 and a remote detonator, something I'd brought for clearing obstacles. It was a risk, but it was our only chance. As we moved past a massive, dead fallen tree, I primed the charge and tucked it deep into the rotten wood. "When I give the signal, everyone goes prone," I whispered into my radio. We cleared the fallen log by 50 yards. The sounds of our pursuers grew louder, closer. They were tightening the net, preparing for the final assault. "Now!" I yelled. We hit the dirt. I thumbed the detonator. The resulting explosion was a violent, shattering roar that ripped through the forest's silence. The rotten log vaporized in a flash of white light, sending a shock wave and a shower of wooden shrapnel through the trees. It was a diversion, pure sound and fury.
"Go! Go now!" Jack screamed.
We scrambled to our feet and ran, a chaotic, desperate sprint for the river. The creatures, momentarily stunned and disoriented by the blast, let out howls of fury. They had been outmaneuvered, their coordinated hunt disrupted. But they recovered quickly. We could hear them crashing through the brush behind us, no longer silent, their rage making them reckless. They were closing the distance fast. The sound of their heavy footfalls was like drumbeats of doom. Derek, helping the wounded Tyler, was lagging behind. I saw him glance over his shoulder, his face set with a terrible resolve.
"Get him to the river," he shouted at me, shoving Tyler forward. "I'll hold them." "Derek, no!" Jack yelled, but it was too late. Derek turned back toward our pursuers, raised his rifle, and opened fire. The muzzle flashes illuminated the advancing horrors, a wave of teeth and claws surging through the trees. He emptied his magazine. Buying us precious seconds, I grabbed the stumbling Tyler and half-dragged him onward. We heard Derek's rifle click empty. Then came a single defiant yell, cut short by a wet, tearing sound. We didn't look back. We couldn't. We burst through the last line of trees and saw it, the moonlight glinting off the dark, fast-moving water of the Hocking River. We had made it. But the price had been catastrophic. We were 3 now. One of us badly wounded, with an army of monsters right on our heels. We had reached the river, but we were far from safe. The hunt was not over. The riverbank was a treacherous slope of slick mud and loose rocks. We half slid, half fell down to the water's edge, the cold spray a shock to our systems. Behind us, the forest erupted with the sounds of the pack. They were no longer trying to be stealthy. Their roars of fury and triumph echoed through the ravine. "Here!" Jack yelled, pointing to a small rock formation that jutted out into the river, creating a natural 3-sided defensive position. "Backs to the rocks. Make every shot count." We scrambled into position, the churning water at our feet, the sheer rock at our backs, and a field of death in front of us. Tyler, pale and shivering, propped himself against a boulder, his rifle trembling in his hands. Hannah was frantically trying to reload magazines with shaking fingers. There was nowhere left to run. This was our last stand. They emerged from the tree line, not as a chaotic mob, but as a disciplined line. There were at least 8 of them. They didn't charge. They fanned out,
a perfect semicircle, their dark forms silhouetted against the woods. They were using the terrain, cutting off any hope of escape along the riverbank, slowly tightening the ring and pushing us toward the deep, fast-moving water. Then, the line parted. A new figure stepped forward, and the air grew still. It was the leader. It was immense, standing at least a foot taller than the others, its shoulders broader, its muscles more defined under its taut, dark hide. But the most striking difference was its head. Its snout was shorter, its brow more pronounced. There was a visible intelligence in its deep-set eyes, a cold, calculating sentience that was utterly terrifying. Its arms were longer, and its hands, they were almost human, with long, claw-tipped fingers that it flexed and unflexed as it studied us. It wasn't just a bigger animal, it was an evolution. It took a step forward, and the others remained perfectly still, watching it, waiting for a command. The leader tilted its head, its gaze sweeping over us one by one. It was assessing the threat. Its eyes lingered on Tyler's wound, on our depleted numbers, on the determined set of Jack's jaw. This wasn't the mindless aggression of a predator. It was the tactical evaluation of a field commander. I felt a profound, chilling certainty. This species hadn't just survived. It had learned, it had watched humanity from the shadows of these hills for generations, studying our technology, our tactics, our weaknesses. The drawings in the bunker weren't just history, they were a training manual. The leader let out a low, guttural click. It was the signal. The battle was a maelstrom of chaos. They came at us from the flanks, 2 at a time, forcing us to divide our fire. The roar of our rifles was constant, a desperate drumbeat against the tide. Hannah was a surprisingly steady shot. Her smaller carbine spitting fire, Tyler, despite his injury, fired with grim determination, each shot carefully aimed. I focused my fire on the flanking creatures, trying to keep them from overwhelming our position. One of them got close, lunging with claws extended. I fired from the hip, a 3-round burst that stitched across its chest and sent it staggering back with a high-pitched scream. But for every one we hit, another seemed to take its place. Trees splintered under their charge. The air filled with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. They were unbelievably fast, moving in a low crouch that made them difficult targets. Through the chaos, my eyes kept finding the leader. It remained at the edge of the fray, observing, directing its troops with subtle gestures and sharp clicks. It was orchestrating the entire attack. I knew then that the pack would never break as long as it was in command. It was the brain. We had to cut it off.
"Jack, the leader," I yelled over the gunfire. "We have to take it down."
Jack had seen it too. While I held the left flank, he moved to the right, finding a clearer line of sight. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and fired. The leader was impossibly fast. It moved just as Jack pulled the trigger. The round that should have hit its chest instead tearing a chunk from its shoulder, it roared, a sound of pure agony and fury, staggering back. But it wasn't down. Seeing its leader wounded, the pack's discipline shattered. They charged as one, a wave of primal rage. It was what Jack and I had been waiting for. In their frenzy, they abandoned their tactics. But the leader, even wounded, was still dangerous. As the pack surged forward, it launched itself not at me or Jack, but at the weakest point in our defense. With a terrifying burst of speed, it lunged past my line of fire and slammed into Jack. The force of the impact was brutal. Jack, a strong and heavy man, was lifted off his feet and thrown against the rocks. Before he could recover, the leader's clawed hand clamped around his chest. It didn't kill him. It didn't maul him. It did something far worse. With its one good arm, it lifted Jack's struggling body, threw him over its wounded shoulder, and began to retreat back into the darkness of the woods. The remaining creatures, seeing their leader withdraw with its prize, broke off their attack and followed, melting back into the trees like phantoms. In seconds, it was over. The clearing was silent, save for the rush of the river and our own gasping breaths. The forest had swallowed them up, taking Jack with it. The silence left in their wake was more deafening than the firefight. It was just me, Hannah, and a barely conscious Tyler, huddled on a muddy riverbank deep in enemy territory. Jack was gone. Derek and Ben were gone. The mission was a catastrophic failure. "We have to get out of here," Hannah said, her voice a raw whisper. She was staring into the woods where Jack had been taken, her face a mask of shock and grief. "Mark, we have to go." My training screamed at me to agree, extract the wounded, fall back, survive. That was the logical, tactical choice. But I looked at Tyler, bleeding and delirious, and I thought of Jack being dragged into the darkness. Alive, I thought of Derek's sacrifice and Ben's silent, terrifying abduction. The Ranger creed echoed in my head. I will never leave a fallen comrade. "You take Tyler," I said, my voice hard. "Follow the river south. It'll eventually lead you toward the highway. Stay in the water as much as you can, it's your best chance." Hannah stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going back in," I said, checking the ammunition in my remaining magazines. I had 2 left. "I'm not leaving him." "Mark, that's insane. You'll be walking into their nest alone. They'll tear you apart." "They're expecting me to run," I replied, my gaze fixed on the dark, menacing tree line. "They're not expecting a counterattack. It's the only edge I have." I helped her get Tyler to his feet. He was a dead weight, mumbling incoherently. "Go," I said. "Don't stop for anything." She hesitated, then nodded, her expression a mixture of terror and respect. "Good luck, Mark." I watched them stumble downriver, 2 small figures against an immense, hostile wilderness, until they were swallowed by the morning mist. Then I turned and walked back into the woods. The forest felt different now. The silence was heavier, charged with a new kind of energy. I moved slowly, using every ounce of fieldcraft I possessed. My senses on a razor's edge. I wasn't a hunter anymore. I was an infiltrator, a ghost slipping through the heart of an enemy nation. I circled back toward their settlement, toward the great arch and the burrow I didn't go in directly. I found a high point overlooking the area where we'd first seen them. The place was stirring with a strange activity. The creatures were moving about, their clicking calls agitated, excited. They were celebrating their victory. In the center of the clearing, I saw it, a crude cage made of woven branches and logs. Inside, I could just make out a human form. Jack. He was alive. It wasn't a larder. It was a prison. They were holding him, studying him. But where was Ben? My gaze swept the area, looking for any other sign. Near the entrance to one of their burrows, a deep pit dug into the earth. I saw a scrap of clothing. It was the same color as the fabric we'd found earlier. Ben's jacket. But the pit was empty. Suddenly, the clicking stopped. The creatures all turned their heads in the same direction. Toward me, I had been spotted. From the largest burrow, the leader emerged. Its wounded shoulder was crudely bound with what looked like moss and strips of hide. It limped slightly, but its eyes burned with an undiminished, cold intelligence. It ignored the cage, ignored its pack. It walked directly toward the ridge where I was hiding. Its gaze locked on my position it knew. It let out a low growl, and the other dogmen backed away, forming a wide circle. This wasn't for the pack. This was personal. A challenge. I raised my rifle, but I knew this wouldn't be settled from a distance. This was going to be close. I left my cover and walked down into the clearing to meet it. We circled each other, two apex predators in a silent, deadly standoff. It was bigger, stronger, and faster, but I had a soldier's discipline and a lifetime of training in finding and exploiting an enemy's weakness. It lunged, not with its claws, but with its body, trying to use its weight to crush me. I sidestepped, letting its momentum carry it past, and fired a single shot into its leg. Aiming for the knee, it howled in pain and fury, its leg buckling. It was wounded, but far from disabled. It spun around, its good arms swiping with claws that could gut me in a second. I dropped to the ground, the claws whistling over my head, and rolled away. I came up with my combat knife in hand. The rifle was too slow for this range. The creature charged again, this time on 3 limbs, a furious, snarling mass. I didn't meet the charge. I used my ranger training, the same training they had so horribly mimicked. I feinted left, and as it committed, I drove myself low and to the right, plunging the knife deep into the muscle of its wounded shoulder. It shrieked, a sound that was horribly human, and threw me off. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. The leader stood over me, blood pouring from its wounds, its chest heaving. Its intelligent eyes were filled with a dawning realization. It had underestimated me. It had mistaken a soldier for simple prey. With its last ounce of strength, it raised a clawed hand for a final killing blow. I fired the last round in my pistol from the ground. The shot went upward, under its jaw and through its skull. The massive creature stood for a moment, a look of profound surprise on its face, and then it collapsed. The clearing fell into an absolute deathly silence. The other dogmen stared at their fallen leader, then at me. There was no rage in their eyes now. There was confusion, fear. I had done it. I had cut the head off the snake. But as I stood there, covered in blood and mud, looking at the disorganized, fearful creatures before me, a new, more terrible understanding dawned. I hadn't won a war. I had shattered a society. I had killed their leader, the one who imposed order, the one who enforced their ancient hidden way of life. And now there was nothing left but chaos. A dozen powerful, terrified, and unpredictable predators, suddenly without a leader, without a structure. I hadn't made the forest safer. I may have just unleashed a new, more desperate and random form of terror upon the world. The king was dead, and the forest was about to become much, much more dangerous.